Hi, I'm Matt Saintsing, and this is yet another episode of the Disabled American Veterans Podcast. And today we're talking all about the PACT Act. The PACT Act, of course, was signed in August. The DAV was instrumental in getting this passed. In a second, I'll be talking to Shane Liermann, who really has been there every step of the way. He was helping perfect and craft legislation before the PACT Act. DAV definitely had their fingers in the PACT Act, and Shane was actually there when President Biden signed the landmark legislation back in August. But we as veterans know that military service is dangerous. Everything from the enemy on the battlefield to the elements can be detrimental to veterans' health later in life, but toxic exposure tended to be overlooked. The veterans who stand to benefit from the PACT Act, their exposure ranges from nuclear tests to Agent Orange to burn pits. But the PACT Act will also help future veterans who have yet to be exposed, which is part why DAV was so passionate about this legislation. But this isn't the first time DAV has been at the forefront of toxic exposure. We're the first veterans charity to bring the issue of burn pits to the media in 2007. And in 2014, the VA adopted a burn pit registry pilot program that was initiated by DAV. But I can think of no one better suited for this conversation than Shane Liermann. So let's not waste any more time and get right into it with Shane. Shane, thank you for making the time today. The last time we talked, there was an agreement in the Senate about making the bill, the House version, the Senate version similar. There was some political back and forth. We'll let others opine about the politics. We're here to talk about the impact. Is it fair to say this is the largest and most comprehensive veteran toxic exposure legislation Congress has ever passed?
Absolutely, it is. The only piece of toxic exposure legislation that may come close was the 1991 Agent Orange Act. And the reason it might come close is because of the impact of the number of veterans at that time. However, they only did have one presumptive disease. Nothing else that's ever been passed into law for veterans toxic exposure is nearly as comprehensive, large, or impacts the number of veterans that this bill does.
Yeah, this really is an overarching, they cast a very wide net here to serve all the veterans in the country, or as many as possible. So what's in the bill here? I know it has been lauded as a, quote, burn pits bill, but it really is more than that.
It really is much more than that. And that's one of the things we've been pushing and talking about. And that's why we were so behind this bill, is because so much of what it does. Now, for burn pits, they recognize 23 different diseases. But to your point, it really does much more than that, because it also adds 6 new countries that are conceded to have Agent Orange exposure, but it also adds 2 diseases. It adds hypertension as a presumptive disease for Agent Orange exposed veterans during the Vietnam era. And it also adds a condition called MGUS, which is essentially a precursor to potential leukemias. So we're not even done yet, right? It does even more than that. As they say, Matt, wait, there's more, because there really is. It also adds 3 new very specific radiation risk activities that weren't previously recognized. And that is for the Inuiatak Atoll radiation cleanup from 77 to 80. That includes a disaster over part of Spain, Palomar, Spain in 64. And it also includes part of Greenland, Thule Air Force Base, where there was an accident there. This is significant because if those veterans did not previously have access to healthcare, they do now, because it's a radiation risk activity. Plus, they also have the ability to file claims for diseases related to radiation exposure as presumptive diseases.
Yeah, so let's talk about what does it mean to have a presumptive condition for toxic exposure. I mean, I think this is language that gets thrown around a lot on Capitol Hill. What does that mean in practice?
In order to explain that, I'm going to jump into what basic direct service connection means first.
Sure.
So if you're a veteran trying to establish a disability related to your service, you need 3 things. You need a current diagnosis of that condition. 2, you need to be able to point to something in your military service or your medical records showing an injury, a diagnosis, or an event. And 3, you need that medical opinion linking that current diagnosis to that event in service. If you have that, you're going to win your case pretty much 99% of the time. But what about those instances where, one, we can't prove that necessarily you were exposed to something, or two, how are you going to get a medical opinion linking your cancer to an exposure that the government may or may not have conceded? That's where it gets tricky, and that's where presumptives come in. So the presumptives that they've established for burn pits and also some of the additional Agent Orange and the radiation risk activities, what they're doing is they're conceding you were exposed to something. So that takes care of number two. Three, they're automatically saying this disease is related to that exposure. So if you think about it from direct service connection, all a veteran needs is to have a diagnosis of a condition. We can show they were in the location where it was conceded exposed, and that condition is one of the diseases on the presumptive disease list. They'll get automatic service connection. So this fills in the gaps, is what presumptive service connection does. It fills in the gaps when we don't know, essentially 2 and 3 for direct service connection. That's why it's so important, because in a lot of these instances, we may never know, right? The gaps may never be filled in by DOD or VA or the scientific community. That's where presumptives become very effective, because it allows veterans to get healthcare and benefits specifically for those diseases instead of waiting for proof and science showing that. This is a huge win for veterans when they establish a presumptive. It really removes barriers for service connection.
Yeah, it takes the burden of proof off the shoulders of veterans to, as you say, prove their individual exposures. If you were in one of these countries or along those times, and if you come down with one of these conditions, we will presume that this condition is from your exposure, and that kind of unlocks benefits, healthcare, and all the stuff that veterans have already earned. So what is the immediate effect this will have on veterans today? I know the VA was really quick in trying to implement this. Can veterans submit new claims today?
They can, and that's what the VA is telling. Now, the PACT Act itself, if you go through and you read through all of the dates, there are certain effective dates when certain presumptive diseases will roll out. Some of them will be not for 2 years or 4 years or maybe even longer. But VA is saying, file the claim now, do not wait. And there's several reasons why. One, it could have an impact on an effective date of the claim. And two, the president made a statement when they did the bill signing for the PACT Act back on August 10th, I believe it was. He made a statement at the signing that they were not going to wait for all of the effective dates when everything rolls out. It leads us to believe we're waiting to get confirmation. VA is going to start processing all of these claims early next year and not wait for these dates that are established on a lot of the presumptive diseases.
So sooner rather than later, if you think this affects you, talk to a DAV National Service Officer. And Shane, I know there's a lot of interest with veterans and our members who are potentially exposed at Fort McClellan, Alabama, which is a now closed Army base that was used to train tens of thousands of soldiers who went to Vietnam. And they're alleging toxic exposure there. Now, does this bill do anything for them specifically, or does this kind of fall outside of the purview of the PACT Act?
Well, actually, we've been fighting for recognition of veterans serving at Fort McClellan for the last few years. DAV has the resolution on this. We're very excited to see there was an inclusion. Now, it's not an inclusion for conceding exposure and presumptive diseases, but it's kind of a first step in the process. They have to, as a part of the PACT Act, create a registry. Veterans who served at Fort McClellan at any time can sign up, and it may include examination. So they want to start recording those veterans who served there and their disabilities and diseases. So this is kind of the first step. It doesn't concede that exposure, as I said, or grant benefits, but this is monumental. We haven't been able to get traction on Fort McClellan in a very long time. So the fact that this was included in the PACT Act for at least a registry, this is a great step in the right direction.
Is this similar to the burn pits registry that the VA has today?
It is, and it's also similar to the Agent Orange registry and the Persian Gulf registry. It's their way of tracking veterans with specific diseases, exposures, and locations. they can use this to help study the impact these diseases are having, the long-term effects. So it's very important for veterans to be a part of these registries. It won't lead to a claim for service connection, but it's going to help veterans who were exposed and their comrades who were exposed in the long run based on the use of collaborations and use of the data they can glean from the registries.
Expose veterans in the future. So this will impact veterans maybe for decades and generations to come. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Well, what it's going to establish is VA secretaries' current established process that they have piloted and been working on a little bit over the last year and a half. So it's going to implement and codify what the secretary is currently doing about finding studies and information and not always just waiting on specific studies, but using all available science and making decisions quicker. We think this is a great place to start. DAV doesn't believe that this is where we should end when it comes to establishing a framework, because again, the secretary has a right to do those things. We think we need to be taking a much more broad retrospective and prospective look at how have presumptive diseases been established over the years. And we have some recommendations we're working on, but this is a great way to start. We believe there can be a lot more done when it comes to establishing a framework for the future, but this is a great first step. It is going to speed up the process for establishing presumptives. Since 2016, there have been numerous presumptive diseases that have essentially been recommended by the National Academy of Sciences, and VA is not taking any action up until recently. The process they're putting in will speed that up.
Absolutely. And if history is any indicator of the future, we know that future American veterans will be exposed to toxic exposures. This goes all the way back to Concord and Lexington, the days of the Revolutionary War, every step of the way. Burn Pits is just the most recent iteration of how we fight our wars, and the sad reality that veterans are exposed. And now it is incumbent on not only DAV and our members, but the entire nation to make sure that they are made whole, or as whole as possible when they come home. Shane, thank you so much for being with me today. And I want to give a special shout out to all of our DAV members who were really engaged on this topic, for sending letters to their senators and their representatives. Shane, anything else you'd like to add?
Well, just to go along with the DAV can in the PACT Act, our members were very crucial in this. Just in the last year, nearly 50,000 letters and emails were sent from members of the CAN, and over 1,500 direct phone calls. Those are the ones we track. Now, there's probably a lot more in meetings, but that is huge. Being actively engaged in this process makes a difference. And I'm a big believer. I've been doing this for 5 years now on the Hill for DAV. Our Commanders Action Network had a tremendous impact on getting the Honoring Our Pact Act across the finish line. And without all of our members taking action, I'm not so sure we would be as successful as we have been.
Absolutely. And again, that's davcan.org to check out all the legislation that DAV supports and maybe send a letter to your elected representative. Shane, thank you so much for being with me today.
My pleasure, Matt. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for listening, and you can learn more about toxic exposures and the PACT Act by going to dav.org. From there, you'll find all sorts of links to resources, including information related to the PACT Act. And if you think this bill applies to you, this new sweeping law that's going to help so many veterans, if you think that applies to you, you can always reach out to a DAV benefits advocate at benefitsquestions.org. And that goes the same if you have any questions about your claim for any other ailments that you are looking to get service connected. DAV is always there to help any veteran get their claims across the finish line. Again, thanks for tuning in, and until next time, I'm Matt Saintson.